This is the second part of our deep dive into the Fluid protocol. In the first part, if you can recall, we broke down the architecture of Fluid and looked at how Fluid lending and Fluid borrowing is powered by the foundational Fluid liquidity layer. In this video, we'll explore how everything connects to enable Fluid DEX. More specifically, we'll break down how smart collateral and smart debt actually work under the hood. So sit back, grab a coffee, this one is going to be exciting. So as the name DEX on lending already suggests, Fluid's DEX isn't your typical DEX. Instead, it deeply integrates with the underlying Fluid lending market. To better understand this integration, however, we kind of need to zoom out and take this bird's eye perspective on Fluid's architecture. So at the core of everything Fluid, you have this foundational liquidity layer. And then you have the lending protocol, which allows lenders to supply a single token lended into this foundational liquidity layer. Next, you have the vault protocol or Fluid's borrowing protocol, which allows borrowers to supply one token as collateral and borrow a single token against it. All of this part is what we extensively covered in part 1 of this video, meaning the liquidity layer, the vault protocol, and the lending protocol. So the focus of this video is Fluid's DEX, and that includes everything that is boxed in red here. So you will see there are various components that make up the DEX. There's the DEX vaults, there's the Fluid DEX itself, and there's the integration to the Fluid liquidity layer. Right, so let's get started. So Fluid DEX, like any other DEX, exposes two kinds of functionalities to end users. First off is it allows liquidity providers or market makers to supply tokens into the DEX, and it allows traders to swap against it. Right, so let's get started by looking at how liquidity provision works within Fluid DEX. So it actually works similarly to how Fluid Vault works, but it differs in the sense that instead of depositing one token, you deposit two tokens. In our DEX example here, you deposit USDC and USDT. And instead of borrowing a single token, again, you borrow two tokens. In our case, again, USDC and USDT. Depositing this token pair is referred to as smart collateral, and borrowing a token pair is referred to as smart debt. So in the UI, you will find all this within the Borrow tab. And you will see there are 4 variations of vaults in total. The first one is what I refer to as the classic vault, which we saw in part 1, which allows you to deposit one asset and borrow one asset against it. Here you deposit ETH and you borrow USDC against it. Then you have what I refer to as DEX vaults, where you either have a DEX component on the collateral side, a DEX component on the debt side, or both. So here I've filtered for smart collateral vaults, and here you can see is an example of a smart collateral vault and smart debt vault, meaning you deposit two tokens and you borrow a token pair against it as well. Again, this is another example of it, but here, for example, you have a vault that only takes in smart collateral, but allows you to borrow a single token against it. In this video, we'll focus on an example of smart collateral and smart debt, because we want to understand the mechanics behind both of those. Right, so going forward, we'll focus on this DEX vault example, where on the smart collateral side, we have the Coinbase Bitcoin Wrap Bitcoin pair, and on the smart debt side, we have this Coinbase Bitcoin Wrap Bitcoin pair as well. As I already said, these DEX vaults are very similar to the classic vault in that their main responsibility is to track the value of collateral relative to the value of the debt. So if the loan to value ratio deteriorates too much, the vault makes sure that a liquidation triggers where the collateral gets sold to reimburse some debt. Now, the primary difference between these DEX vaults and classic vaults is in how they track the value of the collateral and the value of the debt. So the classic vault just tracks the value of the single token on the collateral side and the value of the single token on the debt side. Now, DEX vaults have these smart collateral or smart debt component, and hence they have to track the value of a DEX LP share instead. And DEX LP shares, as you know, dynamically change with any swap that takes place against the DEX, because that changes the composition of these two tokens and through extension the value. All right, let's quickly look at an example of an LP depositing into our DEX vault and look at the various smart contracts involved. So when depositing smart collateral, he can either deposit the right proportions of both tokens, or he can just deposit one token, which would trigger an internal swap that makes sure that this deposit is in line with the existing proportions of reserve of the underlying AMM. Anyway, the vault would then interact with the DEX smart contract, which is this one, to deposit those tokens into the collateral pool. And this is really important to understand because the Fluid DEX has essentially two underlying AMMs, one for collateral and one for debt pool, where each keeps track of their own reserves. These tokens supplied to the collateral AMM pool then get supplied to the foundational liquidity layer, which we have seen underpins everything. And it's this liquidity layer that keeps track of reserves and custodies all the tokens. The tokens are then directly transferred from the user to the Fluid liquidity layer. In the second step, the user would then be able to borrow against his collateral. The DEX vault would then do a borrow against the DEX smart contract. That borrower would this time interact not with the collateral AMM pool, but with the debt AMM pool. The DEX smart contract would then forward that borrow to the Fluid liquidity layer, where the token reserves of this debt AMM pool would get updated, and the transfer of tokens out of the Fluid liquidity layer would happen towards the user. So the end state of all of this is that the user ends up owning an NFT that represents his position. That position is the proportional ownership of the underlying DEX vault. The DEX vault in turn owns shares in the collateral AMM pool and has a liability in form of the debt AMM pool shares. So both the smart collateral here earns trading fees and the smart debt earns trading fees as well. Importantly, the smart collateral here also continuously earns interest rate from the liquidity layer, whereas the smart debt continuously pays interest rates into the liquidity layer. So Fluid has this nice dual capital efficiency on the collateral side and on the debt side, in the sense that the collateral earns trading fees and interest rates from the underlying liquidity layer, whereas the debt also earns trading fees but pays interest rates into the liquidity layer. And the fact that debt contributes to this overall DEX liquidity is really unique to Fluid's design. Right, so you may be a little bit confused by this concept of smart debt. Because after all, how can this debt, as we've seen earlier, that has been taken out of the system through a borrow action by the smart debt LP, how can that debt provide active liquidity to traders that swap one token for another token? Well, the simple answer is that the supply of tokens, or liquidity as the name suggests, comes from this underlying liquidity layer. And the liquidity layer in turn gets this supply of tokens from other applications like Fluid Lending that are supplying tokens into it. Now, importantly, the economic risk of the value changing of that smart debt is fully borne by the smart debt LPs, which are effectively taking on market making risk, because they essentially have the smart debt as a liability. And that smart debt value changes with every swap taking place against the debt AMM pool, because that in turn changes the compositions of the two tokens. Now, Fluid lenders don't really care about this because they are not affected by this price risk. They just see the utilization rates of the assets of that smart debt token pair evolve with every swap that takes place. Because a swap essentially against the debt AMM pool is a borrow and a payback. In any case, more on the trading mechanisms later. But here I just want to highlight that this DEX very much depends on Fluid Lending in order to function. But interestingly, we'll see that Fluid Lending also very much depends on Fluid DEX in order to function safely. But we'll dive into the details of this symbiotic relationship between Fluid Lending and Fluid DEX in much more detail towards the end of this video. Awesome. So until now, we mostly looked at the LP side of things. So how you provide liquidity to the DEX. Now let's take the trader's perspective and let's investigate this swap-in method in order to better understand how a trade is actually executed against the Fluid DEX. And we'll cover the swap-in method by looking at an example of how a trade is executed by taking a Coinbase Bitcoin to RUB Bitcoin swap as an example. So one of the first things this swap-in method actually does is that this trade amount that the trader wants to swap gets routed between the smart collateral AMM pool and the smart debt AMM pool here. Because as already mentioned earlier, Fluid DEX maintains these two separate pools with their own liquidity. On the one side you have smart collateral, whereas on the other side you have smart debt. And this optimal routing between the two makes sure that the trader gets the best possible price. So you can look at Fluid DEX as a DEX aggregator between the smart collateral and the smart debt AMM pools. And also worth mentioning is that these two AMM pools always keep the same price because there's like an internal arbitrage mechanism in case the price deviates at the end of the trade. Obviously, if we want to understand how the DEX determines how much should be routed through each pool, we need to understand the pricing mechanisms behind Fluid DEX. So let's look at this now. So in order to price, Fluid DEX actually uses Uniswap's famous constant product formula, where K is this combined reserve of token X and token Y here. So as K, or measured liquidity if you want, becomes larger, the curve here shifts outwards. Now, in order to avoid wasting capital by providing liquidity along this whole curve here, Uniswap v3 allowed LPs not to provide liquidity along the whole curve, but to concentrate it in these discrete ticks. And to visualize this, I'm taking this nice visualization by Rare Skills, where you can see that every tick price range has a different level of liquidity. Now, Fluid DEX v1 also has a way to concentrate liquidity, but it does not confront LPs, passive LPs, with the difficult choice of choosing their ticks and deciding how to distribute their liquidity. Instead, Fluid takes all the liquidity that is spread across the curve and kind of concentrates it into this DEX pre-configured range. And the red area here contains all the tokens that are actually available within the pool. They are also termed real reserves within the smart contracts. Whereas the blue areas here are called outside reserves and are being extrapolated. So then the sum of the two are called imaginary reserves, and they are then used to calculate the target environment, which is x times y is equal to k. Now you might wonder what happens if, for example, we are at this price here within this red range. And now the price of token X in terms of token Y deteriorates and we move along this curve. And suddenly we are out of this range. Well, in order to fix this and avoid LPs being out of range, Fluid DEX has like this dynamically evolving concentrated liquidity range. And it turns out that this dynamically adjusting concentrated liquidity range works out extremely well for stable pairs as well as pegged pairs like staked ETH with ETH, for example. So let's quickly look at how the DEX makes this range dynamically evolve. So every DEX instance, for example USDC, USDT, has its own configuration, which are stored in this struct here, initialize variables. And the way it works is that a center price is configured as well as an upper and lower bound for the range. And the way the range then dynamically evolves is that whenever the pool price moves beyond one of the thresholds, in this case the price has moved beyond the lowest threshold indicated by this arrow, the rebalancing happens until the pool price has moved within the threshold ranges again. And the speed at which this rebalancing happens depends on the configuration of this threshold shift time variable that we have here. So as I already mentioned, this dynamic range shifting has turned out extremely well for non-volatile pairs, meaning stables and pegged pairs like Coinbase Bitcoin to Rub Bitcoin, for example. But don't take my word for it. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Fluid is now consistently the second largest DEX on Ethereum in terms of volume numbers. And keep in mind that DEX v1 is all about non-volatile trading pairs. So 90% of Fluid's DEX volume is stables and pegged pairs. So when DEX v2 of Fluid comes out, I think it's planned for beginning of September, then LPs will be able to actively market make and define their own ranges on a tick-based manner like they do in Uniswap v3. And that will likely lead to Fluid to clear a lot of volume in these volatile pairs as well, like ETH USDC, Bitcoin USDC, and so on. Because providing liquidity with the capital efficiency that is brought through smart collateral and smart debt is extremely challenging to compete against. So just to wrap up how a swap actually works, we left off earlier here. And just to get back to it, we saw how the amount is routed optimally between the smart collateral AMM pool and the smart debt AMM pool. Then once we have the input amounts for the smart collateral pool and the debt pool, we run them through the pricing mechanism, which we just covered, and we get the output amounts of each of these AMM pools. And these amounts get then all executed against the underlying foundation liquidity layer, which we have already seen. So the token inflowing amounts are executed as a payback and a deposit, and the outflowing amounts, those that the trader receives, are executed as a borrow and a withdraw out of the liquidity layer. So if you think about it, trading against the collateral pool and swapping one token for another is just a deposit of the incoming token and a withdraw for the outgoing token. Whereas trading against the debt pool is just a payback for the incoming token and a borrow for the outgoing token. So since this liquidity layer keeps tracks of reserves and so on at all times, you can look at this whole DEX just as a routing and pricing engine between the liquidity layer and the vaults that we have seen earlier. Right, so I think by now we should have a good understanding of Fluid DEX. We looked at how liquidity is provided to Fluid DEX, and we looked at how traders swap against Fluid DEX. So I think now I want to focus on something I hinted on earlier, which is that for Fluid DEX to really function, it very much depends on fluid lending. Because as we've seen, concepts like smart debt cannot function if there's no net suppliers like fluid lending of actual tokens into this universal foundational liquidity layer that underpins everything. Because after all, traders cannot swap against no tokens. But something which is less obvious is that fluid lending also very much depends on Fluid DEX. And there are two reasons for this. The first reason is very obvious. Well, smart debt leads to higher borrowing, which leads to higher utilization rates on this foundational liquidity layer. And these higher utilization rates leads to higher yield. And high yield is what lenders want. But the second, more hidden benefit that fluid lending gets from Fluid DEX is that it makes the protocol much safer from accruing bad debt. And if we want to understand this, we need to look at how a typical lending protocol works during liquidations. So a typical lending protocol, in this case, we just isolated to ETH on the collateral side and USDC on the liability side. During liquidations, when ETH crashes, for example, severely and rapidly, we witness that ETH has to be sold in order to reimburse the debt, USDC in this case. Well, since over-collateralized lending protocols always rehypothecate the collateral assets for borrowers to earn lending rates on them, the ETH to be liquidated is not always fully available. And hence, we see the utilization rates of ETH quickly reach 100%. And as a result, there's no ETH available to be liquidated and reimburse the unhealthy debt. And this is what is referred to as a liquidity crunch and leads to the accrual of bad debt. Because if ETH continues to crash, well, then the liability side is higher than the collateral side of this lending protocol. Now, interestingly, it turns out that Fluid DEX directly counters this token flow that the lending layer witnesses during liquidations. Let's look at an example. So here I have the drawing of the fluid system in a simplified version. So as we just said, the lending layer typically sells ETH for USDC during liquidations. And so that means that the foundational central liquidity layer within Fluid witnesses ETH token outflows and USDC token inflows, like any other lending protocol. But it turns out that during this exact situation where ETH crashes relative to USDC, the Fluid DEX, which is also connected to this foundational liquidity layer, sees the exact opposite of token flows, meaning that ETH tokens flow in and USDC tokens flow out. And that is because an AMM sees the depreciating asset, in this case ETH, flow in, whereas the appreciating asset, in this case USDC, flow out. This is why liquidity providers face impermanent loss after all. So therefore, the lending layer and the Fluid DEX live in this reflexive, nice symbiotic relationship where Fluid DEX makes the lending layer safer and the lending layer makes it possible for Fluid DEX to offer features such as smart debt, for example. All right, so let's recap what we have done until now. First, we looked at how liquidity is provided to Fluid DEX. Then we looked at how traders provide liquidity to Fluid DEX. And then we explored the different synergies that exists between the different Fluid protocols, like the lending layer and the Fluid DEX. Now let's turn to the economic implications that come with smart debt and smart collateral. First, let's have a look at smart collateral. So in its most simple form, smart collateral is just a way for market makers to, by default, earn the risk-free rate or the over-collateralized lending rate within DeFi on top of what they make through trading fees by providing liquidity to the decentralized exchange. In my opinion, this on its own will make it extremely hard for any kind of traditional AMM that doesn't deeply compose with some kind of lending layer to compete against this. Because what market maker would not like to earn the risk-free rate on top of the trading fees they make? Let's quickly do some napkin math in order to understand the kind of capital efficiencies that can be achieved through that. All right, so here's an example of how you can leverage up your $1 of capital as a market maker. Imagine, for example, we have a Fluid vault where you have smart collateral of the Go USDC pair. Go is the Aave stablecoin, against which you can borrow a single token, say USDC. And this vault has a loan to value ratio of 95%, meaning that you can borrow up to 95% of the smart collateral that you have provided. So imagine as a market maker, you have $100 in capital, which you deposit as smart collateral. Now, against that smart collateral, you can borrow up to $95. Now, these $95 can be redeposited into the smart collateral, leading to $195 of liquidity to the Go USDC DEX. Again, you can borrow against that newly deposited collateral. And you can do this up to 19 times when the loan to value ratio is 95%. And effectively, this turns the $100 that you had at your disposal into $2,000 of liquidity to the Go USDC DEX. Meaning instead of earning trading fees on $100, you earn trading fees on $2,000. Obviously, there are some borrowing costs attached to this because you are borrowing USDC. But as we've seen, smart collateral also earns lending rates. So you earn always by default the Go lending interest rate and the USDC lending interest rate. Right, so that's pretty cool on its own. But in my opinion, the real game changer here is smart debt. Because smart debt is essentially a totally new DeFi primitive that makes your debt productive. So let's add smart debt to our example and see what that leads to. All right, so in our example, I have turned our vault from a smart collateral single token debt vault to a smart collateral smart debt vault, where on the smart collateral side, you have the Go USDC pair like before, but on the debt side, you have smart debt also of the Go USDC pair. So doing the same strategy that we did before, depositing 100, borrowing against it, looping that 19 times in total, leads us to a collateral position of 2,000 and a debt position of 1,900. But the difference here is that the 1,900 are in the form of smart debt. So they directly contribute to the DEX liquidity as well. So before we had 100 USDC that turned into $2,000 of liquidity. Now they would turn into $3,900 of active liquidity within the DEX. So this allows market makers to transform $1 of capital into $39 of active AMM liquidity, and as a consequence earn 39 times more trading fees. So let's think about why this matters. If you think about market making and their profitability, you can essentially break up their profitability in the volume they clear times the fee or bid-ask spread that they charge, minus the P&L that results from the inventory or the assets that they end up with as a result of providing liquidity. And then you deduct also from their profitability the cost of capital, because market making is a very capital intensive business and they need external financing to be able to provide the liquidity. Now, in my opinion, it's the third element, the cost of capital, that gets drastically reduced by smart collateral and smart debt. And if market makers become much more profitable, some of this profitability translate into lower fees or tighter bid-ask spreads, from which every user will benefit. And one more thing that I would say is that this kind of capital efficiency that is only possible within DeFi composability is kind of making AMMs superior to central limit order books. Because imagine a central limit order book where the limit orders that a market maker puts in the order book passively earn him lending rates, and he would be able to collateralize those limit orders and borrow against them, where this loan in itself would actively provide limit orders to the order book. Well, this in a nutshell is Fluid. And I don't think this kind of composability is ever achievable within a central limit order book setting. All right, so this sums it up for Fluid DEX V1. We looked at how trading works, how liquidity is provided. We looked at the synergies between the different Fluid Legos, and we looked at the economic implications of smart collateral and smart debt. Stay tuned for DEX V2, on which I will make a video as well.